some sort of preconceived understanding of what they would like to be doing and what they're trying to encode for, what they're looking for, and what's standing out to them. And markup is interpretive in that the act of encoding will always take place through a connection between an observing individual and a source object. So that relationship between you as the encoder and the document is always a sort of fundamental part of the experience in marking a text up and encoding it. So in using the TEI, we're able to make legible that relationship and that negotiation, and that editorial sort of intervention that you're making in the text. So why should we go through the work of marking up text and doing it? We already have Word documents. We have ways of kind of representing a text, and people can read text without it being marked up. So we know that it's not just about communication, but it makes it more accessible. We can make text more accessible by encoding them and identifying what we mean. It also allows for better distribution. If we can encode a text, and this is where the Text Encoding Initiative really was born out of, was the need to be able to digitally represent text in a way that could be shared across different institutions, again, across different libraries. It allows the text to be really flexible. You can do stuff. When you encode a text, you can manipulate it in various ways. You can aggregate information. You can render it in different formats. It makes them interoperable. So the Text Encoding Initiative, that I is also often understood as interchange. So interchange meaning that you can sort of translate multiple texts, even if they're encoded differently, you can translate them between each other and be able to bring them together. So this is where large corpora of texts, all encoded in TEI, are able to be mutually intelligible. So convertibility, again, so you can convert a text in many different ways when you encode it. And for analysis, so within the digital humanities, distant reading, visualizations, etc., encoding a text allows you to sort of mine or at least retrieve information from that text that otherwise might have been difficult to kind of analyze. And it allows us to answer existing and ask new research questions. So both we can answer questions about what's happening in the text, who's participating, what's going on, but also forces us into situations of asking new questions because we're paying a kind of deep attention to the text in a way that we might not have before. So I'm going to get into a little bit of XML, but if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So XML, and some of you may be familiar with XML, especially for those of us in the library who may be dealing with all sorts of XML. XML is a broad kind of category of things. It is not a set language, but a kind of a grammar. It is a way of structuring information, but it's not a set sort of standard for information. So there's nothing inherent about the function of XML. When we're talking about XML, it doesn't mean one thing or another. Anybody can use XML for any kind of purpose. It's just a structural way of organizing. And anyone can conceive of an XML dialect. And that's what the extensibility means, is that you can use any kind of scheme or standard that you'd like in XML to as an XML grammar. So in XML, what we can do is codify our intentions. So for instance, talking about quotation marks, you say, sure, that could be a quotation, or it could be sarcasm, or it could be skepticism, or it could be a title. So it allows us to kind of disambiguate the various sort of semantic, that semantic ambiguity from those quotation marks. And XML is everywhere. So HTML, as I said before, is XML more or less. Keyhole markup language, so what powers Google Maps, Google Earth, is also XML. So RDF, as I was saying, library catalogs are all powered by XML. SVG, so the scalable graphics that we see on posters and billboards, fonts, etc. That's also XML, OpenOffice XML. And this presentation is HTML, so it is XML, but not OpenOffice XML. But Word documents are all just a bundle of XML all zipped up together. So what is XML? It's hierarchical, it's a tree-like structure, and it's often described in genealogical terms. So here's just a XML sort of dialect that I came up with. Again, trying to go with the Valentine's Day theme. So this is a chocolate cherry mousse from Nigella Lawson from the New York Times. The two pointy brackets that you see here is called an element. So for instance, on that second line where it says chocolate, that's the item element. And all elements have start and end tags. So on line 1 and line 13, the ingredients element, that's the start element. And on line 13, that's the end element. So the end element is always flagged with that slash at the end. So it's sort of like an enclosing structure. You can think of XML like a box or a folder. So with XML, you always have the kind of one side of the folder and the other side of the folder enclosing things. Elements can also have attributes. So an attributes must always have a value. So on line 4 here, that the spaced word quantity is an attribute and measure is an attribute. And the value is the sort of string in the quotation marks. So this item has the item element here has a quantity attribute with a value of 2 and a measure attribute with a value of TBSP or tablespoon. And you can think of attributes kind of like you would in everyday life. So people have attributes, people have height and age, but they always have a value associated with it. So people don't just have height, they have a particular height or have a particular age. In XML, all XML structures have to have a root. So I was talking about this being like a tree-like structure or a genealogical structure. There's always a root element. So there's always something enclosing that XML structure. So here, this is the ingredients element, and that would be said to be the root element. One way to think of this too is if you imagine like there's a bookshelf behind me. You could imagine that if you had one shelf, you'd have a shelf, but if you had 2 shelves, you'd need to have like a bookcase or something. Like so everything always is being enclosed in one structure. You never have kind of free-floating elements. And these elements nest in these genealogical terms. And so by that, I mean that you can say something like the ingredients element is the parent of the item element. And so it has many children item elements. And here, so this XML is denoting that you can use either cherry brandy or kirsch or coffee as the liquid in this mousse. And you can say that the options are child of choice or children of the choice element. You could also say the option element is a grandchild of the ingredients, or that ingredients are an ancestor of option. So there are all these sort of genealogical terms. And then you could say as well that there are many option siblings. So the first option is the preceding sibling of the second option. One of the major components of XML is that elements cannot overlap. So kind of returning to that bookshelf idea, that you couldn't have a shelf and then another shelf and they sort of overlap. You have to have the start of a shelf and end of a shelf, and then you have start of a shelf and end of a shelf. So for instance, here's an example of properly formed XML. XML that doesn't overlap, that is well structured, is also known as well formed. So this is a piece of well formed XML. So you have the beginning shelf element and then the beginning book element, and then the end book element, and then the end shelf element. So they're kind of all nesting. This is an example of incorrectly or malformed XML, because you have the shelf element, then you have the beginning of the book, and then all of a sudden the shelf ends and the book still goes on, which would be sort of messy. So you can't have these overlapping structures. You always have to have them sort of nested within each other. So the TEI is an XML vocabulary. So what the TEI does is it defines elements and attributes to create that standard for encoding text. So all text must be called text. And what was happening was in the 80s and the 90s, when people were starting to create digital editions of text, everybody was coming up with their own standard. And so the TEI came along and said, all text should be called text. All divisions, whether they're chapters or sections or whatever else, should be called div. Don't call them chapter, don't call them section, call them div. All paragraphs should be called P. All words must be called W, etc. And many, many other kind of features and formats. So on the one hand, the TEI was trying to figure out a language to describe text properly, but they also wanted a language that could be used broadly so that everybody was using the same element names and attributes to be able to describe their text and allow that sort of interchange and interoperability between them. So while the TEI was originally sort of created to determine the structure of a text and to be able to make these texts interoperable, as the TEI grew, it became very clear that there are many different kinds of texts out there in the world, and there are many different ways that people wanted to encode them, and different analytic sort of perspectives, and different goals and criteria for how they wanted to be able to analyze their text. So the TEI has grown quite substantially to allow for many kind of become a very rich vocabulary to encode many, many different kinds of texts. So some of the things that you can encode in TEI are bibliographic and structural features. So page breaks, page beginnings, headers, footers, page numbers, line breaks, division, paragraphs, line groups, etc. So the sort of basic structure of a text or a poem or whatever else. Interpretive features. So things like stage movement. So in a play, either in performance or printed, if you know that a character is moving from stage left to stage right, you're able to encode that in TEI. Emphasis, sometimes you'll see italics or underlines in a text and you want to denote that this has been emphasized. Place names, proper names, the direction of dialogue, so who said what to whom, and as well as editorial apparatus. So many bibliographic scholars and textual scholars use the TEI in order to create variorum or collated editions, so editions that have multiple different interpretive or lineage or genealogy of editions. So if you had multiple hands, you're able to encode the annotations by various people on a document. Witnesses, so different versions of a text that'll attest to a particular reading. Collations, gaps, additions, deletions. So marginalia or things that have been canceled or deleted out of a text can all be encoded in TEI. And if you've ever tried to transcribe something that has deletions in a Word document, you'll notice how difficult it is to represent that properly in a Word document and be able to have a readable text. When you're transcribing a Word document or when you're trying to transcribe in a way that is sort of display oriented, you're having to always make a choice between the kind of structure that you want to represent in the end product versus the sort of intellectual structure that you're trying to capture in your document. And the TEI kind of allows you to have it both ways. It gives you the vocabulary to be able to encode those things, but then also render them in whatever way you would like. TEI has also been used quite heavily for linguistic analysis. So people doing linguistic analysis of text, but also for encoding dictionaries, so historical dictionaries. There's also been quite a bit of work recently in using TEI as a way to encode indigenous languages. So for indigenous language revitalization, being able to have a very concrete structure for linguists to create dictionaries and create them in various different outputs and different formats in a way that is sustainable and in a way that is interoperable and preservable. Spoken features as well. So as I was showing with the landscapes of injustice example at the beginning, spoken features, like in an oral history, can all be encoded in TEI as well. So things like incidents, so someone laughs or a car drives by, those can all be encoded in TEI with specialized elements so that you can disambiguate someone saying the word laugh and someone laughing in their speech. Same with pauses or shifts or other communicative phenomena like someone moving their hands or someone pausing. And it's also been used quite heavily for metadata. So there are many projects out there, especially larger libraries, that use the TEI not necessarily for its capacity for encoding the actual body of the text, but for being able to do really rich resource description of manuscripts or other text-bearing objects. So within the TEI, the metadata scheme allows for really fine-grained metadata that's also interoperable with other metadata standards like MARC and other kind of cataloging features. And many other things. This is just like a small portion of the kinds of things that the TEI allows you to encode. Things like figures, videos. At a recent TEI conference, I saw somebody give a paper on using TEI to encode 3D models and text on 3D models, like of a vase. So people are really using TEI for all sorts of things. And so it isn't just about sort of the printed text, even though that is what it's been kind of primarily used for. It goes quite beyond that, or it's capable of going quite beyond that. So what does a TEI file look like? And I've been talking about what the TEI is, XML, etc. So what does a TEI file look like? It always has a root TEI element. So that sort of outer structure is TEI, and that is how you know that it's a TEI element or a TEI file. It may also have something called a TEI corpus element as a root element, which is just a collection of TEI files. But 90% of the time, it's a root TEI element or a TEI corpus element. That root TEI element has a child TEI header, so that describes both the file and the primary source that's being transcribed. So that TEI header contains all the metadata about the document itself, or the text-bearing object or the born digital object that you're creating, as well as all the information about its creation. So things like who encoded it, who transcribed it, publication statement, the sort of original bibliographic source, revisions of that document, etc. Encoding standards, and editorial decisions. And then it has a text element that contains the actual text of the document. It may also have a facsimile element that describes the actual, like that can point to the images of the page. Within text, you can have either a front, a body, or a back, or any of those three. You can have a front and or a body and or a back element as children to the text element. What's very interesting when it comes to TEI's interoperability is that there are many different ways in which people structure their actual texts. For projects that are interested in, say, the sort of print history of a document, they may not consider something that others consider front matter to be front matter. For them, they want to say that this is the body of the text because I think that the front matter, the title page are all constitute the body of this document in my sort of interpretive scheme. Same with the back element. Sometimes that feels like you're relegating something to an appendix if you're interpreting a structure of a text at the back. So a lot of people will use the body for kind of the majority of their text. So this is what you see when you look at a TEI file at the very beginning. The little exclamation marks and the dot, dot, dot are just sort of like elided content. But what you'll see is that root TEI element, you'll notice there is a special attribute there called XMLNS. That denotes what's called a namespace. So that just says this TEI element and all of its children, all of its grandchildren are a part of this scheme that is represented by this URL. So every TEI file will also have that little URL that says, I'm a TEI element according to this scheme, the TEI scheme. Inside of that, we have the TEI header. And so this is the most minimal document. This is a minimal sort of compliant TEI document that you can have. So you have a TEI header. And inside of that TEI header, you have a file description. And inside that file description, you have a title statement, a publication statement, and a source description. These are all required components of a TEI document. So within the TEI schema, there are elements that are optional, since not everybody will want to use them, but there are some elements that are required. So title statement, publication statement, and source desk are all required information within a TEI document for it to be a valid TEI document. And then after the TEI header, you have the text element. Inside the text, you have a body, and then inside the body, you have, in this example, just a small paragraph. One thing, while this isn't a very interesting document, it is, like I said, the sort of smallest TEI document you can have. And I want to call attention here to the fact that the metadata is much longer than the body of the text. Within TEI, metadata is extremely important. And one of the sort of major benefits of how the TEI has modeled its documents and had modeled its scheme is because it brings metadata with the text. Metadata is always considered and always ported along with the text, which is why the TEI, encoding a document in TEI is interoperable, portable, and preservable, because all of that information about that text it kind of goes along with it, not as like a standoff document or something else. You have all of that information encoded right in that document.
Hey, Joey, do you mind if I jump in with a quick question?
Yeah.
If you treat, say, a title page as text while someone else treats it as a front, does that make the two projects less interoperable?
That's a great question. And title page is a very interesting one too, because title page is technically not allowed within the body per the TEI scheme, which I don't necessarily agree with. And I think that title page should probably be allowed in the body. But one of the sort of major components of TEI is that it is also extensible. So if you wanted to, say, add your own element or change the scheme, that is legal in terms of the TEI standard. You have to, but it just needs to be documented. And so there are mechanisms within the TEI that document the changes that you make to the TEI schema and what those changes like sort of consist of. And because the documentation system within the TEI for the schema has that sort of extensibility mechanism built in, that allows things to be a bit more interoperable. So if you were to take that document that you encode a title page in the body of, for instance, in your it's called an odd file, the schema file that the TEI that you'd have with your TEI document, that would describe that change that you've made so that any sort of upstream user or programmatic sort of use of that document would then have be able to kind of know what changes to make it more interoperable. And interoperability, there's very interesting discussions as well about interoperability and interchange, and what the limits are of those documents. So whether or not they need to be exactly the same or whether they need to be able to be made mutually understandable. So I think much of the TEI is about giving the means so that things can talk to each other rather than making sure that they are 100% automatically going to talk to each other. in part because there are always going to be varying interpretations. People need to be able to express what they know about a text and what they know about and how they want to think about encoding a document. So that wasn't it was not a great answer, sorry, but yes and no, I'll say, to making it more interoperable. And that sort of brings me to this sort of document. So this is from a project that I'm currently working on called The Mind and Morning, which is a collection, a 10-volume collection of handwritten letters from Jacobite Scotland. And the way we've encountered this text, and we've had to kind of try to make sense of what all of these different bits are. One of the very interesting things about the compiler, Robert Forbes, is that he often tries to replicate what the letter looked like when he received it. So in the very kind of same way that we as encoders might be using TEI to try and divine what that person was trying to do with their formatting. He too was kind of doing that, trying to make the formatting look somewhat the same so that he could make a case about or be able to represent what was happening on that page properly. So when we started to look at this document, we had to kind of break it down and think about what are the different components and how those would be encoded in TEI. So sort of not thinking about the page numbers at the top, and you can see there are two different page numbers. We have a paragraph that ends right around there, right? It doesn't really look exactly like a paragraph, but it more or less ends there due to the space constraints. Then we have a closer. So a closer in the TEI's definition is that sort of ending part, usually of a letter, but some sort of closing or trailing kind of matter. Inside of that closer, we have a signed or a signature, so the signature of a letter, and then we also have a date line. So on the right here, you can see what that kind of looks like, where we have this closer encapsulating both the signed element and then the date line. In our modeling of this text, and always in doing encoding work, we're always trying to kind of model what we think about a text, right? And trying to sort of understand the model that the text is presenting to us, and then also trying to model it within our own interpretive framework. And here we thought, well, the modeling allows us to say, well, we'd probably read the signed first, we'd probably read the signature first, and then the date line, versus, say, reading the date line first and then the signature, even though on the page you could argue that the date line comes before the signature. Then following that, we can see that we have a postscript. So this is, again, another element that we can say here, this is a postscript. Inside of that postscript, we have a label, the PS, and then the paragraph in the postscript. And then we also have a note. So there's a lot of this sort of trailing material at the end of a letter. And it's, or what we're saying is a note. The TEI has a note element. It's defined very broadly. So we think, okay, a note, nota bene is a note, and it itself has another closer, because this is Forbes himself writing a note and flagging that he is sort of intervening and writing his own annotation to this letter. What this allows us to do, for instance, is having this signed in this note, and we can tag that signed so that it says, so that it relates back to Robert Forbes, that we can, for instance, disambiguate the closers and the notes that Forbes himself writes versus, say, the original letter writer. We can look at all the documents that have Forbes's has a note by Forbes versus, say, a note by somebody else. In doing this in a Word document or transcribing in other sort of mechanisms, this would make it much more difficult. We wouldn't have that kind of capacity because all we'd be able to see is just reading all of this text on a page. So this is, yes, just one kind of example of sort of the kinds of structuring and modeling that TEI would allow you to do. And this is This is taken directly from the documentation that we have for the project on how to encode these sort of very complicated sort of concluding structures. And the TEI is huge. I just counted the elements this morning, 586 elements as of this morning. And it grows, usually grows, it sometimes shrinks, but almost always grows every 6 months. Because, as I said before, the TEI, the community and a consortium of users. So as people encounter new things in the text, they can raise issues with the TEI. There's the TEI listserv, and there's many different communication methods in which someone can say, I've encountered this thing in a text, but the TEI doesn't have any description on how to handle it. I think it should be handled this way, or how have other people handled this? So the TEI is often growing because we continue to find texts that do really interesting and challenging things. But that said, no one uses the entirety of the TEI tag set. I was talking before about all of the different features. The Line of Mourning project, for instance, does not make use of any of the utterances or the pauses or the moving of stage directions. So we don't care about that stuff in the TEI because it's not part of our project, but instead we care about a very different subset, the manuscript stuff, the hand stuff, the handwritten structure stuff. So what projects tend to do is they tend to take a subset of the TEI, or they customize the TEI for their own needs. So taking this large schema, which is called TEI all, and then they whittle it down to the sort of subset of stuff that they care about, in part because in many editorial environments, like editing environments, when you're encoding, you're given a list of all the elements that are available. And sometimes that ranges into dozens and dozens of elements, and some of them you just don't care about. So you create a smaller subset of the TEI in order to kind of work for that to work within your project. It kind of gives you that sort of, you're kind of creating your own schema. So for example, a drama project will use the drama tag set and discard the linguistic and dictionary stuff because they just don't need it. I'm going to show a few examples of the guidelines. So all of this information, when I'm talking about all of these elements, and I'm saying that the TEI defines note broadly or defines something in a particular way, all of these are on the guidelines, which are best accessed on the web. I think they used to be printed at one point and they were huge volumes, and now I think they are only online. So this is at teic.org. It is maybe a little bit of a dated looking interface, but it is a really rich sort of resource and contains a wealth of information. So the TEI is structured in these chapters, and each chapter defines a number of elements and gives recommendations for how something could be encoded. So for instance, if you were wanting to do, let's look at the chapter on names, dates, people, and places. This gives prose describing how to use an element, how this element often came to be, or what the kind of underlying principles are for that element, and give lots of examples of various ways in which you can encode using a particular element. These are, as you can maybe see from the length of the scroll bar here, extensive chapters. They're really great reading, especially like, you know, if you're, you know, looking to do something on a Friday night. I feel like a TEI chapter is always a good thing to curl up with and read. And it gives a lot of information about all the different elements and all the different structures in which you could do something. Some people find the TEI frustrating because it gives you so many options and so many choices. The TEI often gives prescribed sort of mechanisms for encoding, but it gives many of them. And it says you could do it this way, or you could do it one way, or you could do it another way. All of these are valid and all of these are fair. And that's in part because encoding, as Flanders et al. Said earlier, it is a strategic process. You have to decide what you want to encode. In the TEI guidelines, if you are looking to encode a particular thing or you're curious about an element, each element has its own page. That page gives a gloss of that element. It tells you where that element is defined, or more appropriately, where the information about that element is, and how to use it. All of the attributes that are allowed on that element. So for instance, the forename element, you can use something like a ref to denote a sort of canonical reference to that first name, or a type or a subtype, so that if there are different kinds of forenames that you want to encode in your description of a person, for instance. It also outlines all the things that can contain, in this case, a forename. So these are all the elements that can contain a forename, and these are all of the things that a forename can contain. And you can see it's really extensive, again, because the TEI schema tries to be open and fairly permissive to all the different variations of things that could occur in a text. In a particular project, you might constrain that because you know that a forename for your project is never going to contain notated music, for instance. So you can whittle down those options so that as encoders, you have fewer options and your sort of project schema is a bit more constrained. But the TEI tries to kind of keep things fairly open. And just another example of an element. This is sort of, these chapters, these pages are really, really useful when you are looking for, you encounter something in a text and you don't know what it is, or you have an idea of what you might be able to call it, like a gap, but you don't know exactly the variations of a gap that you might have. So for instance, they give recommended values for the reason attribute on a gap. So if you wanted to have, if you had multiple gaps in a document, for instance, but sometimes that's because it was burned in a fire, and so there's a gap in the text because there's smoke damage. In other cases, it might just be irrelevant. You've decided as an editor that this is just the part that you don't care about, so it's irrelevant, or it's due to sampling. So you only wanted to do the first verse and not all the rest of the verses when you're encoding your text, and you can say that explicitly with this element. And then when other people look at this text, they'll be able to tell that that was why this text is fragmentary. It's not that you didn't have the rest of it, or that it was that you found some variation of this text that only had one verse, for instance. And so in doing this kind of encoding and looking at the TEI guidelines, often we're kind of presented with a wealth of choices. And I look at the TEI guidelines and I get excited to see all of these different things. And it's like, oh, I didn't think about gaps, or I didn't think about, page numbers or notated music or whatever else when I started to encode. But now that I see that that element exists, of course, I want to use that. That's exciting. But we always want to remember that first, input doesn't equal output, that what you encode won't necessarily always make it out into your final product. So you're not encoding for what something's going to look like. And you want to encode what you care about as an encoder, as a project, and what you have time to encode. You could spend your entire life trying to encode a document so that you can capture every character, every difference in like sort of printing, mark, etc. But maybe that's just not what you care about in a project. And if you don't encode it, you can't do much with it. So that's sort of the reverse, is that if you work through a corpus of documents, you have 300 texts, and you don't encode it, but then you want to do something with it, that can be also a challenge. So it is a bit of an iterative process, but it is also one that kind of requires sort of laying out from the beginning what you're kind of hoping to find, what you think you might encounter, but then also allowing yourself to kind of be surprised by the things you do encounter. I didn't think, for instance, in the Line and Morning project that we would care as much, or we'd find so many really complicated structures at the end of the document. And so we've had to work to make those structures available to our schema. But on the other hand, in looking at the Line and Morning, there are many different ways that Forbes will draw a horizontal line. And for a while, we were we've been encoding those, but that's something that takes quite a bit of time to encode all of the horizontal lines and the variation of their width, etc. And the question that we always have to ask when we see something interesting is, do we really care about that? Is that something that we care about representing in our encoding? But yeah, so you don't need to encode or retain everything. And just a little image that I saw on back when it was Twitter, but sort of you don't always need to retain everything within a text. So it's not always that you have to read the history of that text always through your encoding. So when I'm talking about this sort of making a subset, there are tools out there to do this. So the TEI has a language called odd that allows you to customize a schema. This is a tool developed from the TEI that allows you to kind of do this in on a website. So you don't have to get in there with the sort of coding in XML to make that subset. You can do that through this web interface, and allows you to kind of see all the elements and pick and choose which ones you want to give yourself, give your project a customized schema. This is an excellent tool, and if you are embarking on an encoding project, I really encourage you to look at Roma and look at the sort of auto customization mechanisms, because it's part of that kind of making choices and being really deliberate about what you want to encode and what you don't, what you might find interesting and what you might not. Okay, so let's say you're convinced, and now you want to start doing some of this encoding, and how can you kind of proceed with this sort of encoding? Since TEI is XML, and XML is a text format, you don't need any special software. You can encode in encode in the Notes app on your phone if you wanted to. But there are tools that make it much easier. There are programs that make it easier. Most prominently used one, and the one that supports TEI encoding probably the best, is Oxygen XML Editor. This is not a free or open source program. What it does is it knows XML really well. So it has a lot of very helpful features for telling you which elements exist, or what elements you can you can nest within other elements. Helps with closing off elements sort of automatically, but also validates your document. So it makes sure that this document is conforming with the TEI schema. So it has that validation built into it. So if you tried to, say, notated music inside of an imprint, and let's say that wasn't allowed in the TEI schema, it would put a red underline there, like a spell check, and tell you that, no, this isn't allowed there. Another option is VS Code or Visual Studio Code, which is, if anybody does any programming, you may be familiar with it. It's a very sort of robust editor. And while it doesn't handle XML very well on its own, there are extensions, including the Scholarly XML extension written by Raf Vigliante, who is also a member of the TI Council. So it's very much sort of this extension, the Scholarly XML extension, does some of the kind of has some of the features that Oxygen has. It isn't as robust, it isn't as fully featured as something like Oxygen, but it is free. This is a really sort of nice tool, especially if you're just kind of getting started with wanting to encode in XML. And then there are sort of what you see is what you get tools, or what you see is what you have encoded for you. So the tools that are available, these are really useful, especially if you're wanting to sort of teach and train about the idea of textual editing and of critical editing, and kind of wanting to pay attention to the text and a little bit less of the sort of pointy braces. So TEI Publisher is one example. It's both a publishing platform for TEI, but it's also it has a editor built into it. So in TEI Publisher, you can encode your text and then also display collections in multiple ways. It has the sort of model that it uses, it sort of displays things quite nicely. in sort of multiple formats. So you can see facsimile beside original text between editorial and modern text, so long as you sort of follow the sort of guidelines that TEI Publisher kind of has their own schema. TEI Publisher is a sort of a program that you have to install on a server, so it's a little bit more resource intensive. LeafWriter, which is a really exciting project out of the Links project, it is a online browser-based XML and RDF, or resource description framework, editor. So it connects with GitHub, GitHub being a versioning software, such that you can open a free account on GitHub, have your TEI XML in your GitHub repository, and then open it up in LeafWriter by going to the URL, and then encode that text, see the encoded text, but also do a lot of linked data sort of tagging. So tagging people, tagging places, and allowing for that true sort of really rich interoperability that like the linked web sort of promises. So this is just an example of what LeafWriter kind of looks like when I put in a text from the Winifred Eaton archive. Didn't do anything to it other than just sort of pasted it in. And here you can see it gives you like a good sort of editor. We could add paragraphs, etc., in this editor, as well as do things like tagging for individual people. So you can highlight, click, and it gives you, it searches various sort of entity repositories, like Wikidata, DBpedia, etc., and allow you to kind of link those entities with the text. This has multiple schemas of the TEI that allows you to use as well. So the TEI all schema, the kind of big one, also the Orlando's projects, sort of custom schema, or TEI Lite, which is like a sort of smaller version of the TEI all schema. This also is useful as it shows you the raw XML on the side. So you can see what you've done to your TEI when you're sort of using the kind of more user-friendly interface of being able to sort of highlight and describe and tag documents. So you can see here, possibly, I know it's a little small on the screen, but you can see that this has created a person name element around where I highlighted Winifred Reeve and linked it to the VIAF record for Winifred Eaton. So it does that kind of, and I can do this again just as an example. Right. Again, select. It has all sorts of other these are sort of attributes like your level of certainty, what kind of person this is, so and all sorts of other kind of markup capabilities that are built into the TEI. I can give you a you can kind of use this to select attributes. And now you can see, just doing that, I get another person name here that is now wrapped around that Onautowatana, that name. You can also see the markup on the side here, that very much that tree-like structure that we were talking about before. So this is a really great option for working with text, especially if your focus is on entities and on linked data, people, places, objects, things. And it's a really nice sort of low, sort of not very resource intensive way of kind of working with TEI, annotating it. So let's say you've done all of that encoding work. And then what can you do with it? If you have any TEI document, you can use the service from the TEI called TEI Garage, which allows you to convert from documents or presentations or spreadsheets. It's like a sort of Swiss Army knife for the TEI. So frequently what you do is you take like a TEI document and you're able to convert it into any of these formats. This is also really useful if you want to get started with TEI. So say you wanted to use something like LeafWriter, you could take a Word document, for instance, convert that into TEI, and because Word is not going to be a semantic, it doesn't have semantic markup, it's going to not be the best TEI. You're not going to have the sort of kind of rich TEI that you would get from doing all the encoding yourself straight away, but it can give you sort of basis for your TEI encoding. You could put that into LeafWriter, and then you could start to annotate and add and sort of enrich that structure of that document. So yes, so this sort of allows you to go both ways in terms of taking a document, putting it into TEI, but then also taking a TEI document and converting it into something else. So for example, that TEI document that I was showing before, which is just a sort of a little bit from A Christmas Carol, when put through TEI Garage from the P5 XML version to a PDF, and this is what we get as a PDF sort of automatically from the TEI. Again, because the TEI is not a display format, the standard style sheets for creating these PDFs have to make assumptions about what you want in your document. So it makes kind of guesses, like for instance, it puts the document author in italics. You might not want that in your PDF. There are ways to tweak that as well, but in many cases you'll want sort of a more customized sort of manipulation of these documents, which is what you might want to use something like citation for. This is a JavaScript library that allows you to take in TEI and display it as HTML without having to run any conversion processes. And this will also allow you to do all sorts of things like customize the styling, customize behaviors. This is great in terms of resources as well, because you can create really rich websites and digital editions and showcase the sort of information in your TEI document without having to have a server. All you need is a JavaScript library to then display these documents. So this is a very low resource, sort of minimal computing mechanism for creating these documents and for proofing them and for just kind of playing around with them. And so you want to learn more about TEI, because this is a very quick session. I would highly recommend the DHSI session on text encoding fundamentals and their application, taught by Constance Crompton and Lee Zickel. I know that this will be an excellent sort of introduction to TEI. Because of that interaction between the encoder and the text, it's really, really great to just have a sort of concentrated time to be able to do this encoding work, to be able to sit with the text and encode and kind of work through and talk to others as you're encoding. So this is a DHSI or other sort of like longer training opportunities for working with TEI are really useful, in part because the TEI is so community-based. It's so great to be able to talk and sort of work through these things with others. So if you're wanting to learn more as well, there's the TEI guidelines. The TEI guidelines does have an introduction to XML, as well as all of the documentation, as we saw earlier, about how to encode. TEI by example is another great resource if you want to kind of work through encoding problems, and it gives a variety of sort of frameworks for things like letters or poems, sort of common documents and common sort of features that you might see, and how it can be encoded. It also has little quizzes and modules for sort of working through common encoding problems. TEI also has a GitHub account. This is where you can raise all sorts of issues. If there's something that you notice about the TEI guidelines that you don't think is right, that you've encountered in your text, and you think that the way that the TEI understands this phenomena doesn't accord with what you can see in front of you, the GitHub is a very active place where people can make these sort of suggestions and really make the TEI their own and make it work for their projects as well. And then the TEI listserv is a really wonderful place of sort of collegial exchange and asking. It's completely open to anybody. who's interested in the TEI, who has questions about the TEI, who has questions about encoding, you'll get like very thoughtful and hopefully thoughtful and useful responses to any kinds of questions that you have. It's a really great resource. Great, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Joey. That was brilliant. There was one question earlier that I wanted to pass on to you. So does the TEI lend itself to light analysis, like cross tabulations, for things that aren't too hierarchical? For instance, can it be used with qualitative data analysis tools like NVivo or MaxQDA?
I will say I don't think there's automatic sort of imports into NVivo. But I'm no NVivo expert. But I do know that, for instance, for the Endings project, one of the things that the Endings project did were interviews, and they did qualitative analysis, sort of grounded theory coding. And those results, that was all done in TEI itself, and the results and some of the analysis has been published now in the Digital Humanities Quarterly. So there are instances of people using the TEI for that kind of analysis. Whether it fits into the kind of existing tools like NVivo, I'm not sure, but it definitely can be used for that kind of like semantic and overlapping kind of coding of analytic features.
One other question, if you had already created a large text-based digital project that's not in TEI, any tips for how to convert it to TEI without too many tiers?
I would give sort of the TEI Garage a shot. If it's in something like, it depends on the format, of course, but if it's in something like plain text, or if it's in, say, Markdown or something, there are already conversions in there to handle it. That said, if you're converting from a presentational format to a descriptive one, you're always going to have something kind of missing. There's always going to be a gap there that will need to be supplemented. But the TEI is, because like I said, it's very, very flexible and open. So at the very least, you'll be able to get something like, this is my text, and these are blocks of text in there, for instance. Standard tools with that too, they're in the GitHub for the TEI. There's the TEI style sheets. So if you know XSLT or are interested in learning XSLT, which is the programming language for translating XML documents, transforming XML documents, those style sheets can be very, very useful for either doing that translation or at least informing that kind of translation from one format to another.